Thank you so much for listening to my story. On April 20th in 1999, I was a senior at Columbine High School when 2 gunmen killed 12 students, a teacher, and then killed themselves. Today, I'm approaching my 7th year as a high school English teacher, and I'm also the executive director of a nonprofit called the Rebels Project, named after the Columbine Rebels. It supports survivors of other mass traumas. It took me a little over 10 years to confront and reflect on how the shootings at my high school impacted me, but I've learned some valuable lessons. One that sometimes needs reminding is that trauma recovery has no timeline. Another is that we can help by providing children with the tools to support them as they build resilience. During the shooting, I was barricaded in a small office with 59 other students while the gunmen rampaged the school. 3 hours after barricading, we were escorted out by SWAT team members and past the bodies of 2 students who were shot outside, Danny Roybal and Rachel Scott. Much later, I learned that the SWAT team, thinking there were still gunmen loose in the building, decided to save us instead of seeking out Dave Sanders, who eventually bled to death just a few rooms down the hall from where we hid. Sometimes these details are enough for the average person to be horrified enough to keep their judgment of my recovery to themselves. However, many times I still find myself having to justify the depth and complexity of my trauma and why I struggled for so long. Later that evening, I arrived home physically uninjured, but a completely different person. My sister, a freshman in 1999, hugged me in the driveway, feeling grateful and guilty that she got out of the school relatively quickly. I graduated and went off to college where I experienced being blindsided by a trigger for the first, but certainly not the last time. You see, what I didn't remember was that the fire alarm had been going off while I was trapped in the office. So when the fire alarm sounded in my English class to signal a drill, instead of evacuating like everyone else, I started sobbing uncontrollably. I tried to advocate for myself to my professors and was told I still had to write my final English paper about school violence or fail the class, even after confessing that I had been at Columbine. I ended up failing that class. And actually, I failed English class twice in college, which makes my students now laugh. My first semesters of college were some of the hardest times in my life. After being surrounded by loved ones and by a support system made up of people who understood what I had gone through, I was now embarrassed, shameful, and isolated. I was also really angry, not surprising to anyone who knows anything about grief or trauma. For me, the manifestations of that trauma were that I developed an eating disorder and I tried drugs. The drugs were fairly short-lived, and lucky for me, they weren't addictive. As for my sister, she just celebrated 3 years, clean and sober, and will continue to fight each day for her recovery through her trauma and through her drug abuse. I did attend formal therapy and received validation from my therapist, someone my family was lucky enough to afford, that it was okay that I was traumatized, even a year later. Silly me, I thought I should have been over it in months. Eventually, I dropped out of college completely, and I worked full-time. For anniversaries, I went out of town to avoid the memories, much like many of my students feel now when they're reminded of the traumas they've experienced. Once I had a student who stopped coming to class because the anniversary of their traumatic experience was approaching. Later, they told me that they had to build up enough courage to come talk to me about it because they were so embarrassed. I imagine this is similar to how I felt when I attempted to talk to my college professors. Other tragedies also impacted me. 9/11 sent me into hysterics and prompted severe flashbacks. Virginia Tech resulted in several debilitating anxiety attacks, and I embarrassingly had to call into work. That was even 8 years after the attacks at Columbine. Though the company I worked for was pretty understanding, I could tell that there were frustrations when I couldn't show up. In 2009, 10 years after the shooting, I reconnected with people who knew what my struggles entailed. As a result of these renewed connections and acceptance I felt when returning for the anniversary, I went back to college. At first, my brother had to come to campus with me to help me navigate and feel comfortable, but eventually I was a full-time student again, majoring in English and working toward my secondary teaching license. Now my struggles were mostly in math because I teach English. After co-founding the nonprofit in 2012 and having the opportunity to travel and connect with other survivors across the country, I began to see more clearly the ripples of trauma and the similarities that exist no matter the circumstances of the event. Columbine and my story are often sensationalized, one of the reasons I imagine I'm here today. But the feelings I experienced in the months and years following Columbine, anger, loneliness, isolation, and embarrassment, are not unique to mass shooting survivors. For my students who have been traumatized in other ways, no less valid or less seriously, they are sometimes too young to be able to reflect on why they are reacting the way they are. Survivors are blindsided by triggers all the time. Right now, the survivors in my support network who are from more recent shootings are asking about fireworks and how long it will be until they stop diving for cover. For children and for my students, they may be blindsided while reading a short story, or they might tune out and stop listening to instructions. They may need choices of topics to research, to write about, or to study in order to avoid their freakouts. I've also heard countless stories of survivors trying drugs and alcohol to help them numb the pain and blur the memories. And not many of my students' families can afford therapy like my family could. The school therapist schedules is always jam-packed. And many of those who could benefit from therapy are embarrassed about it because of the stigma, and many times they've convinced themselves or have been convinced that whatever they're going through doesn't warrant therapy. I also consider how triggering events might impact my students. Would they react like me and avoid talking about it? Would they react in anger and in defiance? These questions and concepts are explored during trauma-informed professional development so teachers can best support the needs of their students. As a teacher, I wear many, many hats, but I'm not always qualified to provide the support needed. Schools need more counselors, more social workers, and more psychologists. They need programs that teach children how to build resilience, how to use coping skills, and how to practice self-care. At my school, we average one counselor to every 400 students. Increasing these services will not only help children who have experienced trauma, but also help provide the skills necessary to build resilience before a traumatic event. Trauma is, in fact, a universal part of the human experience, and because of this universal experience, it's critical that we address this underlying issue that connects many of our current problems. Trauma is connected to suicide, to abuse, to drug addiction, and even to classroom management issues. Please consider these needs in order to ensure that all children who need mental health support in schools and in communities have access, and not just after a traumatic event, but before as well. In closing, and I understand that this might be really hard to do, but please do not compare our traumas and our experiences on this panel. Our stories and experiences are very different, but trauma is trauma across the board.